Okay, welcome to the Music Room. I'm covering two albums today. The first one is the Rain Man soundtrack from 1988. And the second one is called This Mortal Coil. And this album here is It'll End in Tears. These two particular albums remind me of my roommate Dan that I met in Atlanta, Georgia, when I was going to graduate school at Georgia Tech. And we're going to talk a lot about Dan today. So let's get started. My first year of going to Tech, I get a call from some guy in France. And he says, "Yeah, this is Dan." I'm like, "All right." Says, "Yeah, I know you're from New Mexico State." And I was like, "Okay." Woo! I got nothing on this guy. So we talk about going to Tech and kind of what it is to go to graduate school, because he's considering attending for a PhD in digital signal processing. So he basically decided to come. So he moved back to the States, moved back to Atlanta, and he found a place to live there, real close to the campus. And so I think that was in March of probably 1989. And my first roommate, Russell, had moved out of the House of Fans there about a year after we both arrived, and I had an I had extra room available, but I hadn't had a roommate yet. So I see Dan on campus one day. This is right around Thanksgiving, and he says, we kind of chit-chat about stuff. And he says, "Well, I might see you in New Mexico at Thanksgiving." And I'm like, "Well, I'm not going to Las Cruces." He says, "Well, neither am I." And I'm like, "Where are you going?" He goes, "Well, I'm going to Los Alamos." I'm like, "For what?" He goes, "Well, I grew up in Los Alamos." And I'm like, "Huh?" Because Dan's like 2 years older than I am, and Los Alamos isn't really that big. I didn't know him from there. And he says, I said, "Where did you live?" And he said, "Well, I lived on 43rd Street. I'm like, "Off of Sandia." And I'm like, "I lived on 45th Street off of Sandia." So it turns out that I lived about, as the crow flies, our houses are about 100 yards apart. Same neighborhood, same group of kids. We knew everybody, but I never met Dan. It turns out that my mother was Dan's little sister's Girl Scout troop leader. Who knew? Anyway, so that's getting weird. So anyway, he moved into the House Fans there at 1989, probably around 1990, and he didn't have a car. He just lived there, walked to campus, and he spent all of his money on CDs. So we'd go up to the mall. We'd go to Lenox because there was Tower Records there, and we'd go up there and listen to stuff. And Dan would almost always buy one or two CDs to come home with. And what I've learned from living with Dan was he kind of focused on three areas. And these three areas are nothing like what I would get there. Because this is the time, it was like Pearl Jam and that kind of thing. He'd get female vocalists. At the time it was like 10,000 Maniacs with Natalie Merchant, or Indigo Girls or something like that. Or he'd get soundtracks, oddly enough. Or he would get covers. And so whatever. He'd listen to something for a little while, and he'd put it in his buy pile, and we'd get out of there. So we're going to talk about those today. We're going to talk about soundtracks, which is what I got here, Rain Man. We're going to talk about covers and female vocalists, which is what's on this other this Mortal Coil CD. Okay, so first of all, soundtracks. I've learned kind of that this is my interpretation of soundtracks. There's like three different kinds. There's the one that the at the time, to me, a soundtrack was something like there's a movie called The Big Chill. The Big Chill soundtrack was really quite popular because the songs that were chosen for The Big Chill, it was a movie about a bunch of college friends getting together for one of their people in their group's funeral, and the songs were really integrally tied in with the movie storyline. All right, so some other examples of soundtracks are like well, this one's on like an oddity. The Blues Brothers has a great soundtrack, but that's actually more musical-ish than it is a movie with a soundtrack to it, because they're musicians. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is another really popular one. These are one of the classifications is these stories are really quite tied into the storyline. Then you have other soundtracks that are done by a composer like John Williams or James Horner, and those things are like Jaws or 2001. What's another one? Oh, Star Wars, of course. So those ones are done by an original composer, and they are the songs that were developed for the movie became the hit. Okay, so like we all know what the Jaws theme song is. Okay, the last type of soundtrack is one that's really subtle, and that is where someone in the production crew has carefully chosen really well crafted choices to set the tone in a movie. And like we'll be talking a little bit more about that here in a minute, but I don't know. I think at the time this is 1980. This is about 1990. I know that when I was going to graduate school and undergrad in Las Cruces, one of the soundtracks that we played a ton of there was the Pretty in Pink soundtrack, because it had New Order on it. I don't know. It had a lot of different types of things on it. So graduated in 1993, and a lot of you have came out to my graduation and met Dan, and so I do have a story about Dan. So probably because he didn't have a car, his faculty advisor gave him an old Chevy van, and this van was really a POS, and it like an example when all of us piled. I'm going to tell you one side story, and then I'll tell you a couple of side stories about this van. So, the first one is Carl and Eric used to live down the street, on Center Street there in Atlanta, and we all get in the van, and the van is probably 15 years old at that time, and it was gutted. There was no interior in it at all. There was like bench seats in the back. And it wasn't a Chevy van like that guy sings about in Chevy Van in the song. It's more like a passenger van with glass windows all around. And there was no upholstery in it. And it's just beat to crap. And it's rusted and it's just a pile. And we're going somewhere in the rain. And Carl's like, Carl named the van the Sex Machine primarily because it was never going to see any. And so that's what we called Dan's van. We call it the Sex Machine for years and years and years. At my graduation, all of my friends from high school and college, my undergrad college friends, came out to Atlanta, and a lot of us piled in the Sex Machine, and we went over for a lunch over in Little Five Points. And the van had a peculiar characteristic where once it got warmed up, the motor wouldn't turn over, because it had a rough spot in one of the pistons, and the things would expand because metal expands, and the engine would hit that rough spot, and then it wouldn't turn over. So your only recourse was to let it cool off. I mean, really let it cool off. So I'll show you a picture of all of us in Little Five Points and parked right there on the street, waiting for the van, the Sex Machine, to cool off. Anyway, let's continue. One more side story. So, one of the memories that's really burned into my memory was we were out driving, and we were coming back up to the House Fans there, and we're cruising up the slight hill there on 10th Street, and we get to the stoplight at I don't know what street it is. It's where the Papa Murphy's is. The Papa John's there is on 10th Street, and so we're at the stoplight. The light turns green, and this guy on a moped blows by us. And I just start laughing. And Carl's in the back. He's laughing as well. And Dan's like, what's so funny? And I'm like, Dan, you can't live this down. He goes, what? He goes, you can't let a moped pass us in the sex machine. And he's like, but I like mopeds. All right. Okay. I'm going off into the weeds here. All right. Let's get back to the storyline. Okay. Why did I pick a Rain Man soundtrack? So at some point, I graduated from Georgia Tech and I moved, and I was doing, I don't know, I did some work for a while. And during that time, Dan went back to Los Alamos to visit his brother, and he stopped by to visit my mom, which I think was great. And he just wanted to see how she was doing. And he brought her a CD of the Rain Man soundtrack. So there was a song on here that my mom just absolutely loved. It is Side 1, Song 3. And we'll put it on here. And we'll try to play it. Now, we're going live here today. Normally I kind of mix in things behind the scenes, but we're just going to do it. And I'm pretty bad at queuing up records, but you'll get the idea. All right, that's the song before. Okay, here it is. This is called Dry Bones, and it's by a band called the Delta Rhythm Boys.
Ezekiel connected them dry bones. Ezekiel connected them dry bones. Ezekiel connected them dry bones. Now hear the word of the Lord. Well, your toe bone connected.
Okay, so this is a song that we would actually sing on road trips when we were growing up, and this is, my mom loved this song, and whenever she'd play this soundtrack, she would get up and start singing this song. Knee bone, your knee bone connected to your hip, that kind of thing. So when I look at I'm going to pan this down. So when I look up at the wall here, I've talked about this before. You see album covers, like there's Sting, there's a U2 album, Pretenders, and that kind of thing. I don't see that. When I see the Rain Man soundtrack like this, this is a picture of Dan. Now, it's not. Well, there's these two guys here. If anything, Dan's the more like the Dustin Hoffman character than the Tom Cruise, but we won't go into that. So I did a startup in Florida, and eventually that kind of went away. I didn't have places to live. This is about 1998, so I called Dan, and he's now living in Cambridge. He didn't graduate from Georgia Tech. They kind of cut off his funding at the 5-year mark, and he decided to get a job and work on his dissertation from afar. So he moved up to Cambridge, which is a suburb of Boston, and he was working at an MIT lab called Lincoln Labs, supposedly working on his dissertation. I said, "Do you got a room up there for me? Because I don't have any place to go." So he said, "Yeah, come on up." So I moved in with him, and by then he had continued buying CDs this whole time, and he now had racks of CDs. I kind of estimate he had about 800 CDs, again with the 3 groups as well as some other stuff, but primarily those 3 groups. And so on the female artist side, if there was a woman singing, he'd buy it. And that's when I became exposed to things like Enya, Sarah McLachlan, the Cocteau twins, Jewel, Tracy Chapman, Natalie Merchant, Tori Amos, and somebody called Jane Siberry. These are what Dan would listen to. And he also continued to buy cover albums. And if you get these cross albums, like female artists singing cover songs, go on a cover album, he'd have it. So, like an example of that is there's a Sean Colvin album called Cover Girl, where she sings all covers on the entire album. And so what I've learned is that, I have a bunch of female artists over here. I have Cocteau twins, I have Sarah McLachlan, I have a lot of those similar types of artists over here. And one of the things I do have was there's the second one I'm going to talk about. But for me, an oddity is that I absolutely love covers, and I don't know why, but I do. Even really, really horrendous covers. The worst cover that I think I've ever heard is William Shatner doing Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Oh, it's horrid. It's so bad, it's comical. Now, not to be outdone, Leonard Nimoy also has a album out as well, which is equally as bad. But I guess back then, I mean, you got to milk your fame wherever you can get it. So, all right, we're going to talk about soundtracks. Let me turn this one off over here. So the subtle soundtracks, Dan he must have had hundreds of these soundtracks, and so I'll give you an example of one of these soundtracks, which is very, it's great. It's a great soundtrack. In fact, if you look up, some of the best movie soundtracks of all time, one of those is going to be High Fidelity. And High Fidelity is a movie. It's a John Cusack movie. He's starring with Jack Black, and he is he owns a record store somewhere, and it's a story about him going back and kind of finalizing his relationships that he's had in the past. And so there's a scene in High Fidelity where John has up in his apartment, he has hundreds and hundreds of albums, and he's got them all on the floor, and they're stacked. And one of his employees comes up and he's talking to him, and they're looking over things. I have a link for this down in the comments. He's looking over these albums, and he's like, "You sorting your albums?" He's like, "Yep." He goes, "You doing it chronologically?" "Nope." "Are you doing it alphabetically?" "Nope." And John says, "I'm doing it autobiographically." And I was like, "Oh." And Dan laughed out loud, because this is something that he would consider doing with his 800 CDs on the wall. Now, if you go and you say, "Hey, Dan, where is the so-and-so album?" he would know where it is. Now, it would take you 5-10 minutes to find the dang thing, but he would know where it is. And I never really quite figured out his method to putting them in. But this was his passion, buying these CDs, so he knew where they all were, and they weren't in any kind of order. The thing only made sense to him, which is okay. That's fine. Okay, so what I've learned is that those real subtle soundtracks are really, really very good. And the reason why they're good is because they're basically mixtapes. Now, for all you kiddos out there who are listening, you may not even know what a mixtape is, but way back in the day, people would make mixtapes, and they would plop in a cassette into their tape deck, spin some records, and cue things up, and much like we're doing today, and put a variety of artists on a cassette tape. And they were all given as gifts. You'd have them in your car. You'd have different types of mixtapes for different moods and that kind of thing. Right now, this is all handled through playlist mechanisms on Spotify and Pandora and that kind of thing. But you had mixtapes. And then when CDs came out, you would have mixed CDs as well. Okay, so on the subtle soundtracks, there's a person on the movie set called the music supervisor. And they are the ones that pick the songs. And you can tell if if the supervisor is a hack or they're really good at what they do. And I'll give you an example of a hack. If you have a scene covering anything that have to do with Vietnam War, and they play All Along the Watchtower by Jimi Hendrix, that supervisor is a hack. Because that song is tied to too many movies. And if you pick that, you're just a copycat. There's what in the middle of the 60s, you can't find another song that you can play. No, it's always All Along the Watchtower by Jimi Hendrix. And at that point, I don't even want to listen to the rest of the choices that they pick in the movies because they're just all, it's just poor choices. Okay, so the High Fidelity is a great, it's a great soundtrack, and I suspect, I didn't look this up, but I suspect Cusack was part of that because the Grosse Pointe Blank soundtrack as well is excellent because it just picks all the 80s songs, not the popular ones, but the ones that where people would actually listen to that were part of the 80s, and that's why those ones are good. Now, so I will. Let me see, where am I on my list here? I don't want to miss anything. Okay, so I decided to leave Boston, and I moved out to Colorado. And on my way out, basically out the door, I said, "Look, Dan, Dan wasn't doing too well up there because his dissertation was this giant 800-pound gorilla that he had been working on and off, but it was really a drain on on him personally, was this dissertation thing." And I said, "Dan, I'm moving now, and I'm going to go find out what my next step in my life is. And when it comes time for you to move out of Boston, I want you to call me, and I'll drop whatever I'm doing and help you move." And so 5 years later, in 2004, he calls me, and he says, "I'm moving back to Atlanta." And I'm like, "Okay, when?" He goes, "Thursday." And I was just like on a Monday. I'm like, "I'll be there." And he's like, "Okay." So I flew in. I'll show you a picture of Dan sitting in the U-Haul. We packed up the U-Haul. He drove the U-Haul down, and I followed him down in his mom's car. And we booked on back down to Atlanta. And by then, I believe that Dan had finished his dissertation, and he was leaving Boston behind him. And so he has a completely different life than the time I lived with him in Atlanta, the time he was living in Boston. He's been married for quite some time. He has 2 beautiful daughters. And I'm continually reminded of Dan, and I'll give you an example of how that works out. So I'm watching a movie with Melanie about 6 months ago, and it is called Seeking a Friend for the End of the World. That's a movie with Steve Carell and Keira Knightley. And as I watch these movies now, I kind of listen. I've been kind of trained by Dan to listen to the choice of music in these things. It also drives me nuts when I'm in a restaurant as well. That's a different story altogether. So that movie, I got all the way through that, and I'm like, the choices for that were just on the money. Okay? Real deep songs, deep cuts off of songs, not the hits that the artist had. You really had to be a connoisseur of music to really know that person knows exactly what they're doing. And it turns out that if another thing that I had almost the same reaction to is The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel on was it on Netflix or Amazon? I think it's on Amazon. Whoever is the music supervisor on that is choosing 80s songs for a show about that occurred in the 50s. And they've really done a great job of picking the right songs. I'm talking like picking a go-go song for some kind of mood you want to set for a storyline that happened in 1950-ish, that kind of thing. So Dan at some point told me, I said, "What do you want to do?" About this time he was about to move. And I said, "What do you want to do, Dan? What's next for you?" And he says, "My dream is to work as a music supervisor for movies." So this is what he wanted to do. And he's ideal for that because he had a wide variety of musical tastes. And certainly not anything I would ever buy if I went into Tower Records or wherever. And so Dan's had a major influence in bringing to my attention female artists, soundtracks, and covers. And I'm going to play this last song here off of a 4-album set from a band called This Mortal Coil. This Mortal Coil is actually like a 4 CD set. 3 of the CDs are all covers. And they're done by various artists. Some of them you know, some of them you don't know. And then the 4th one are all originals. And what the song out of all those that is hauntingly beautiful is sung by the Cocteau twins, and it's called The Song of the Siren. And it's off of this release called It'll End in Tears. And I'm going to go ahead and start that. And I'm going to say, Dan, you're a real true friend of mine. And we're going to hit this song. Now, this song is also covered by Robert Plant, which is a different take on this. This song was originally written and recorded by a songwriter in the 60s. His name is Tim Buckley. And let me see here. We'll just stop this thing. And we'll make sure we're over here. Okay, so I'm going to play a little bit of this, and we're going to close out, and I'm going to say, Dan, I know I asked you when your birthday was. I wrote it down somewhere. I can't find it. So it's right around this time frame. If I'm late, I'm late. If I'm early, well, then I'm early, okay? Thanks, Dan, for all the things you've done for me and for my mom. And we're going to go ahead and play Song of the Siren by the Cocteau twins.
On the floating shipless oceans, I did all my best to smile till your singing eyes and fingers drew me laughing to your eye, and you sang, said to me, said